All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. We are very happy to have you all here. So we are going to be talking today, a webinar on the crossroads, the intersection of victims and law enforcement advocacy. We do have the Newport News Police Department Domestic Violence Team here with us today, and I'll introduce them shortly. Just a couple of housekeeping items that I want to review before we get started. Everyone here, so all attendees are in listen only mode. If you have a question for the presenter, please place that in the Q&A box and we will either, if those are questions that are pertinent to what we're talking about at the moment, we'll go ahead and interrupt and ask those questions. All the questions are answered. If you have things you want to comment on, or if you notice there are any issues with the webinar, please go ahead and put those in the chat box and we'll get those attended to as soon as possible. As far as following the webinar, we'll issue certificates, recording, and any additional resources. Those will all be emailed to everyone who has attended. And if you are a call-in listener today, please go ahead and email Ashley at domesticshelters.org to share your email so we can send those resources to you. Everyone here should be familiar with domesticshelters.org, but just in case there's someone tuning in that hasn't heard of us yet, we are the fastest growing online resource for domestic violence information. We help over 2 million people each year find the answers they need about domestic violence. And we operate a searchable database of over 2,800 domestic violence programs in the US and Canada. If you're unsure, if you operate a domestic violence program or shelter and you're not sure if you're in the database, just send me an email. My email address is below, Ashley at domesticshelters.org. And if you're in the US and you are not yet using our wishlist program that allows people from all over the world to, within a couple of clicks, send you donations. If you're not using that platform yet, please reach out to me as well, or Rachel, so RACHAEL at domesticshelters.org. And either of us can help you get started there. And don't forget, we have a Facebook community for domestic violence professionals. You can go to domesticshelters.org Facebook page and learn more about the group there. All right, and last announcement. So the new Purple Ribbon Awards launched January 1st. We will be giving out up to $30,000 in grants to our top winners. And we are looking to recognize not just, shelter advocates and volunteers who, certainly deserve a lot of time and attention, and we'll be recognizing them, but we'll also be recognizing those community support people like law enforcement members and legal advocates and, civic groups, things of that nature. So learn more about the different award nomination categories at purpleribbon.awards.org, and we'll be accepting those nominations through March 31st of this year. And so we'll get started shortly with this webinar, but up next week, don't forget that we have a webinar, our part 2 to traumatic brain injuries with Rachel Ramirez of Ohio Domestic Violence Network. So if you're not already signed up for that, please go to domesticshelters.org/events to find more information and the link to sign up for that. And you can always, if you didn't attend part 1, go to our webinars section in our video section on our website and watch that first part, so that way you're up to speed for part 2. All right, so what you've all been waiting for. So let me real quick introduce our lineup of speakers today. We have Lieutenant Shauna Lee Ross, who is the Newport News Police Department Lieutenant. Cheryl Chavers, who is the Domestic Violence Specialist. Nisha Himes, the Domestic Violence Outreach Liaison. And Michelle Juneau, who is the Domestic Violence Detective. We are so happy to have everyone here today. We'll wait for them. They'll go ahead and turn their camera and microphone on so we can see all their lovely faces. Hello, ladies. Thank you so much for being here today.
Hello, good morning.
Have you? Yes. Oh, so just so everyone knows, we've got almost a little over 350 people tuning in right now. So we're so excited to have such a great audience. I know this is such an important topic. So many communities out there are looking for ways to better involve their police departments in their outreach to really, help survivors get a better result. So we're so thankful for the work that you're doing. And with that, I'm excited to hear what you have to share today. And we'll go ahead and advance to the presentation.
Hello and good morning and good afternoon to everyone who's joining us today. As stated earlier, I'm Lieutenant Shawnee Ross with the Newport News Police Department, and I've had the pleasure of serving this community for 21 years and counting. And I still feel just as passionate today about the work that I do as I did the day I walked through the door. So we're going to introduce each one today, and bear with us. You know, COVID has really changed the dynamics for us. We want to have an interactive conversation today so that, one, we're not only introducing who we are and what we do, but also that we can get the message out that it takes more than just the 4 people you see today, that it takes each and every one of you who are joining us as well and beyond. And what we'd like to share is this really important intersection for survivors of domestic violence, advocates who are part of it, and law enforcement, prosecutors, all these different components that play a role in this really terrible social dynamic that's called domestic violence and intimate partner violence. It's something that has long been neglected as a subject that should really garner much more attention than it really does. So today we are honored to be here with you and to have a chance to share our program and what we're doing and these important things that we want to carry forward and hope that each one of you will be able to take back to your own organizations or in your own homes and share with more folks as well. So the Newport News Police Department Domestic Violence Team began with an idea that started with knowing that domestic homicide has been a long problematic issue where law enforcement agencies have said, how do we deal with this? How do we reduce domestic violence homicide? How are we able to get ahead of it? How can we change this dynamic when a lot of times it's happening behind closed doors? It's not like police officers are driving by and can see that things are getting ready to become violent. Much of domestic violence and intimate partner violence is hidden away. So how do we make this better? And that question spurred more questions of, well, not just domestic violence homicide, but domestic violence, period. How can we make a difference? And what we noticed that in the last 5-10 years, law enforcement agencies across the country have developed programs that have been very, very effective for reducing other types of violent crime and other crimes in their communities, all except one. And that's intimate partner violence. So the question remained the elephant in the room. You know, how do we approach this? How do we create change in a community? And it's those questions that led to us developing this team. What we find is that if we separate, and law enforcement just does law enforcement things, and advocates just do advocate things, and prosecutors just do prosecutor things, and survivors just do survivor things, then none of us are intersecting and none of us are communicating and helping each other. By bringing all of these components together, we found a really remarkable and effective method for attacking intimate partner violence. And we're really excited to see that not only is the concept and idea a good one, it's working. We are seeing real results, measurable results by joining all of the different components together in this intersection. So what we have is comprised of law enforcement from the police department, and we have advocates who are civilians. They're not sworn police officers, and the advocates are responsible not just for direct crisis advocacy, but they're also able to do community outreach and education. And another important component is the education of our own law enforcement officers. And I'm going to talk about that in a little while, But what we found is it's just as important for first responders to be educated on trauma and on responding to intimate partner violence as it is for our advocates to be prepared to have these tough, challenging, bold conversations with survivors as well. So a little bit more about me. I have been with this agency, as I said, 21 years, and I have certainly gotten to experience so many different things, but I am a Canadian transplant. So hello to all the fellow Canadians out there. I came to the United States in 1998, and I became a police officer with Newport News Police Department in 1999, and have been here ever since. And you know, from the early days of being a patrol officer in my car driving around, I remember being impacted by family violence. And as a young 24-year-old officer, I went to this call for service, and there were two parents in the front yard screaming at each other. And there was a little girl sitting on the front steps of her porch. And when she saw me walk up, she ran to me and flung her arms around me. And I remember being shocked by this experience, but it marked me forever. It marked me in the weight of the responsibility that I had. And that day I talked with mom and with dad and with daughter, and there was no law enforcement action. It was that intervention. It was that moment of creating an eye-opening change in that family. And it really took off for the rest of my career. And so all these years later, I sit here excited to be a part of this initiative and to see where we go in the future. And I want to turn things over so we can keep going. Next to me here is Miss Nisha Himes, and she's going to introduce herself to you and tell you a little bit about how she came to be here.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Lieutenant, for that introduction. I'm very excited to just be here talking with you all, and specifically for just working along this amazing group of people. Just to give a little bit of background about myself, I am the domestic violence outreach liaison here for the department. I am very passionate about domestic violence. I'm a survivor. I was in a very toxic and violent relationship for about 5 years, and then dealt with some things even after, once I left for the last time. That relationship included pretty much most of the forms of abuse that you can think of, to include just the consistent verbal and emotional abuse, the mental, psychological, physical abuse. I've had broken bones, black eyes, I've been strangled, you name it, I've probably gone through it. So once I found the courage to leave that relationship, I started speaking out against domestic violence maybe about 2 years after leaving. And what I found was, what was supposed to help heal me, it was helping other people. I didn't realize that so many people were going through the same thing, either currently or had gone through it in the past. It was women, it was men, it was children. And I learned that a lot of the barriers that I faced when I was in that relationship wasn't just barriers only specific to myself. It's people who are having trouble getting out because of financial reasons. It's people who didn't have support, or felt that they didn't have support, were too embarrassed to say anything, ashamed, or what have you. So I started talking about it. And again, once I started speaking out, I learned how many people it actually affected. So I wanted to do more. So I tried to, at the time I was working for a real estate law firm, and I tried to get a job in like shelters or, you know, jobs like this. And I was having difficulty breaking into the field because at that time I was told that I didn't have enough experience as far as like degrees or anything of that nature. So for me, I'm all for higher education. I applaud schooling, but I'm a firm believer that once you've survived domestic violence, that's a whole, there's no piece of paper to me that can tell you how to survive domestic violence if you've never gone through it. So me, not from Canada, I'm from Jersey. So me being from New Jersey and having that fire and that spunk, I said, you know what, well, I'm going to do something about it. And I started my own nonprofit organization to assist victims and survivors. So shortly after doing that, I got a job with the local Commonwealth Attorney's Office as a domestic violence victim witness advocate, and I learned the court system. So I got to see the other side of the fence. I got to see what the officers deal with when they go to court, and maybe you're witnessing a survivor on the stand recanting, you're not really understanding why they're recanting. But I was that survivor who has recanted and hidden bruises and said nothing is wrong, nothing happened. I was that survivor whose officers have come to my home and I felt dejected and not wanting to share what was happening with me. And then there were times where officers came and I felt empowered and thought maybe I can get out of this. So working in the criminal justice system on that end allowed me to see a different side of the story. So after leaving the Commonwealth Attorney's Office, I came here with the Newport News Police Department as of April, started in a pandemic. And it has just been an amazing experience. I worked with some amazing, passionate people who are all here to fight this thing called domestic violence. So that's it about me. I love chocolate chip cookies, in case you know. I always say that every interview is, oh, I love chocolate chip cookies as well. So, and I'll turn it over to Miss Cheryl Chambers.
Hello, everyone. So glad to be here. I'm Cheryl Chambers, domestic violence specialist, and I was born and raised in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. So bonjour tout le monde. Hello, everyone.
Oh,
Just a little bit of French here. But I migrated to the United States to attend university. I wanted to get a Bachelor of Social Work degree. And my last year in school, I ran out of funding. And so what do? You start applying for all the different scholarships that are available. And I finally got a scholarship. I didn't know what the requirements were, but when I got it, I found out that I'd have to work with individuals who had experienced domestic violence. I had not been personally impacted by it, but part of the grant requirements required for me to go out into the community and talk about domestic violence, bring awareness to this issue. I had to man a crisis hotline. I had to work in a shelter. And that experience changed the trajectory of my life. And I realized that just because it hasn't happened to me, it doesn't mean it shouldn't matter to me. And this issue matters to me significantly. And so after I graduated with the Bachelor of Social Work, I came to Newport News, Virginia, and began a very long career with the local child welfare department. For over 18 years, I spent working with families of children who've experienced abuse and neglect, sexual abuse. There was domestic violence in the home, oftentimes substance abuse, mental health challenges, issues with finances. And it was my job, my responsibility to work with the family, conduct a needs assessment, and try to fill those needs with the resources in the community. And so I spent a lot of time doing prevention. And I'll never forget, there was a chance where there was an opportunity where there was a child who was being abused, and we had to remove the child out the home. And the father barricaded himself inside the home. And I had to call law enforcement to come and to help me. And those officers saved my life. They were able to keep the father at bay, and I was able to run into this home that was filthy, filled with feces, filled with food everywhere, clothes. It was dirty. And I had to pick up this little toddler, and the only clothes and items I could find for him were some roller skates that I put on this child, and ran out the door as officers kept him at bay. And I was so grateful that those officers saved my life and this child's life. And I said, if there's ever an opportunity that I can give back to these officers, I would like to do that. This opportunity is it. Because what I know is that domestic violence calls are some of the most dangerous calls that officers can go to. And 28 to 30% of line of duty deaths stem from domestic related calls. And so if I can be a part of the solution to prevent that from happening, then I want to do that. And so I also spent a lot of time working in the foster care system. Oftentimes, children, unfortunately, would have to come into foster care. I would work with their families to ameliorate those issues and help them achieve reunification. Sometimes those children had to achieve permanency, meaning being in another home, adopted. And so my whole goal was to help families achieve safety, stability, self-sufficiency, and to link them with support in the community. And it's really, truly been an amazing opportunity to be able to do that. I'm also in the process of completing my dissertation, a doctoral degree on organizational leadership with an emphasis on behavioral health. And my research is focused on domestic violence. What I found is that there's a lot of research about domestic violence, but there's not a lot of research on domestic violence advocates. And so my focus for my research is on the influence of self-care and the prevention of compassion fatigue in domestic violence advocates. Because if our advocates who may experience vicarious trauma, burnout, or compassion fatigue, if they're not able to do this work, then that impacts the survivors of domestic violence. And so we want to make sure that all advocates have the opportunity to take care of themselves so they can continue doing this noble work. And a shout out to domestic shelters, because when I was doing my research trying to find organizations where I could recruit participants, I was able to go on domestic shelters, and they provided me with all the information I needed so I could reach out to the various organizations. So I'm very grateful for domestic shelters. And I will turn it over to Michelle Juneau, Detective Juneau.
Thank you, Cheryl. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I am the newest member to this team. Very happy to be here. I'm Detective Juneau with the Newport News Police Department. I've been an officer for 11 years. Prior to becoming a law enforcement officer, I received my degree from Old Dominion University in criminal justice and sociology. While at ODU, I was an intern with the York Pocosin Victim Witness Assistance Program. So if you're logged on, hey, how you doing? And there I really got to integrate myself with victims, particularly victims of domestic violence, and got to hear their stories and realize a lot of their stories matched what I was currently going through while I was in school. So I became very attached to those victims and speaking with them and learning about it wasn't just me that I was experiencing. So after that, I got out of my situation, became a police officer, and while doing patrol, that was mainly what I did. Lots of domestic situations, lots of intimate partner violence that I responded to. I began to see a trend and a breakdown in communication with other officers that may had responded to their residents multiple times. A lot of times we would go out to the same individuals, and I began to realize that an ongoing situation was occurring with those families, and we were responding to right then and there and not receiving much of a background. And after speaking to a lot of victims and hearing their stories, I became intrigued and wanted them to know that they too can get out regardless of their situation, regardless of their position, that they, whether it's financial, which I experienced financial hardships, whether it's possibly going through losing your child or the fear of losing your child, which I too also experienced going through court proceedings and things like that. And I wanted them to know that they too could get out and make a life for themselves and their children. So once this position opened, I knew right away that it was going to be my position, just so I could really be the gap between victims and law enforcement. A lot of victims that I experienced had a distrust for law enforcement, that you don't care, or and so I wanted to be that bridge that to my victims, that we do care, and this is the reason why we care. Sure, there's frustrations on both sides, on law enforcement side and victim side, but I feel like I could play in a very important role in making sure that my victims understand what that frustration is and how to overcome it. And with the great assistance from my team, able to continue in providing them services. And if I don't know, I definitely reach out to them. So it's definitely a working machine right now, and I feel very blessed to be on this team, and I feel confidence every day that I speak with some of my victims on the phone. I feel that they're gaining the strength and they want to push forward in the court proceedings and get justice, and that is one of my driving forces of being a member of this team. And So I'm very thankful. I'm thankful for everyone who's tuned in and watching us and listening to us right now. Thank you. That shows your level of dedication, and I'll turn it back over to Lieutenant Ross.
I feel like, yes, we do have a poll question coming up. I feel like I need to give high fives all around.
So I've launched the poll question. I don't know if you want to go ahead. So I'll just read it real quick. So it says, I believe law enforcement has a good understanding of the barriers domestic violence victims face when trying to leave their abuser. I'll go ahead and leave this up for another 20 seconds or so.
That's a phenomenal question. And in fact, it's interesting when this question is asked to law enforcement officers and when it's asked to advocates and when it's asked to citizens, we get a very different response almost every single time. But I believe the results are going to show us a very interesting answer.
All right, I'll go ahead and close it out here in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at those answers. What do you think?
Are we able to see the answers?
And I'll read that off so you can see the screen. So 57 or 18% of people answered true, and then 252 or 82% answered false.
Wow.
Yes. And you know, I have to agree with that assessment. I believe that's true. I would have said that law enforcement does not understand. And that launches us into one of the really critical components of what we're doing. And we're living in this era where law enforcement it's time for a change, for us to open our eyes, and we're not just doing a job that checks boxes and we go on to the next problem and the next problem and the next problem. We're in the people business with human beings who are just like us. We all have our families, our homes, our personal trials, and just because I put on a uniform and I perform a law enforcement task is a unique game changer. And it's really important for police to understand that we're all humans and we have to understand the elements of trauma as they are critical in that very first moment. And Nisha, you talked about in your past where the police officers who responded to you, they either made you feel not cared about or like giving you hope. And folks, today, our messaging is loud and clear. There is hope. And that's the message we need to push, because together, as we intersect in these crossroads, we find education for police officers to understand that the first words out of their mouth could make or break the situation that they're in, and that the quick connection to advocates doubles down on and I like to call it bubble wrap. If you have something that's fragile and breakable, such as a survivor who is just trying to get from one moment to the next, we're going to bubble wrap. And that means that I had better, as a first responder, understand the effects of that trauma, why counterintuitive behavior comes into play, why they might not tell me everything that's happened to them, just that in that moment there's a problem. And later on, more might come out if I do my job right and make a connection and build trust. Those components are so critical. But Ms. Himes, will you go in and talk a little bit about what outreach is for you and what we're doing and how that works in to our organization?
Yes, so my job largely in part as the domestic violence outreach liaison is to do just that. It's to reach out. I'm very vocal about domestic violence. I feel like we can talk about domestic violence anywhere, if you're in the grocery store, and this has happened, going to Walmart or Target or whatever, and wearing a mask like this with the purple awareness ribbon, and someone may not know what the ribbon stands for, or may say, oh, you know, I'm a survivor too, and that has led to whole conversations in the grocery store line, you know, even bringing the other people in line into the conversation. So that's what awareness is bringing awareness where awareness isn't. So again, Ms. Chambers and I, we started in a pandemic. We started in April, and I've never worked at a job where my first day, it's like, okay, you know, what are we doing? And it's like, we don't know yet. You know, we have to, and this program implementation has just been so exciting, because taking all of our visions and building this working machine, this genius as a survivor and an advocate coming in here, and it's like, wow, we get to bring awareness in a different way. It's just been so impactful. So, and first coming on board, we started in the Community Youth and Outreach Division, and then learning that we wanted to do more as far as being able to provide direct advocacy and services to the victims and survivors. They moved us to the Special Victims Unit. So my first day, I swore I heard the Law and Order theme music walking in the halls. And you know, it's just been great to work in this with this team of people, and we deal with such a vulnerable population. So a lot of my job is reaching out, just like I did with Domestic Shelters, who has been an amazing just resource throughout the years, whether it's providing great webinars, resources, training, articles. It's just been a plethora of information to provide, not just to the victims and survivors, but to the community that we serve. So being able to reach out and do webinars such as this, when we're able to go outside more as far as just with the social distancing, we'll do more events as far as speaking out in community at churches, schools, awareness walks, whatever we have to do to get the word out. We've been reaching out to businesses in our community, large organizations, talking about workplace violence. Do you know how to recognize the signs if your employee is going through domestic violence? Do you have a policy within your organization that addresses domestic violence and provides resources to your employees who are being affected? We have, since coming on board, also offered training to officers. Me and Ms. Chambers, our first week, our first month here, we did a tour around. We went to in-service trainings and talked to over 400 officers and talked about domestic violence, how it's not black and white, how there's so many gray areas. We talked about the experience as a survivor that I've had, where meeting with officers and I left feeling unempowered, that I would never call for help again. I don't have anybody on my side. And then there were experiences where officers empowered me and let me know that my life mattered. So these are the lessons that we're teaching our officers here, so that they know, okay, if I go to this home and it's not an arrestable offense, maybe it was just an argument that a neighbor reported, it doesn't mean something is not wrong. So you know what, I'm going to call our domestic violence team, which happens often, and Ms. Chambers will further elaborate, but we'll get calls from officers while they're on the scene saying, hey, you know, it's not an arrestable offense, but we feel like something is wrong here. She or he mentioned that their finances are controlled. Can you talk to them? And we'll talk to that survivor and say, hey, you know what, how can we help you? Maybe you're not ready to talk right now, but can you give us a call tomorrow? We also do a lot of advocacy in-house, so where survivors will come in and meet with us. We refer to resources in the area, our local shelters, our local Commonwealth Attorney's Office. We work great with them. So even if it's not something we can provide directly, we're doing that bubble wrap, that we're surrounding them with support. So it's like, okay, this is what we do here. Next up, you will talk to an advocate with the Commonwealth Attorney's Office. They'll be able to assist you with the court process. You can talk to an advocate with this shelter. They can provide you with emergency shelter, counseling, support groups, things like that. So it's just to wrap them with support. So in a sense, that's what I do. And as you can see, I love to talk. So that's where that outreach comes in. So we'll just turn it over to Ms. Chambers to explain what she does as the specialist.
And I just want to piggyback on what you said, Ms. Himes, in regards to officer referrals that they'll send us. what often we'll do is reach back out to the officer after we've
Yes.
made contact with that victim survivor and we've assessed her situation and put some resources in place. We will reach out to that officer to give them an update.
Yeah.
Because many times officers will respond to a scene, but they don't necessarily know, well, what happened afterwards? Is this person going to be okay? Did they have everything that they need? And so that update to them is invaluable. As a part of my role as domestic violence specialist, I have the opportunity to do strategic planning. And that is looking at the internal guidelines here at the department and saying, you know what can we do to address this issue of domestic violence? And so we have taken a multidisciplinary approach, a multi-pronged approach to addressing DV, which is victim advocacy, law enforcement training and engagement, community awareness. Data analysis is a huge component of what we do. We're so fortunate that the leadership here at Newport News Police Department has allowed us to have the resources that we need so that we can be successful. And part of that success is looking at the data. And so they have assigned a crime analyst to our team that we're able to access resources and data and information from. Another big piece of what we do is, as Ms. Himes mentioned, is the awareness piece, but also making sure that we have the resources that our victims need as they begin to rebuild their lives. So we're looking for a database in terms of what resources are out there in our community that we can link victim survivors with to be able to help them. So we have a database of over 160 resources in this community to be able to help point them in the right direction, whether that's financial assistance that they need, whether that's daycare services, whether that's emergency shelter, whatever it is, we want to be able to bridge that gap. And so we have the opportunity to always assess, what can we be doing different? What can we do to help individuals in this regard? And so I really appreciate being able to work with this team. And part of that is also working with our domestic violence detective on those high-risk cases, and she'll talk a little bit more about that. But the best part of this job is being able to talk with victims in the middle of their crisis. I spoke with someone the other day who said she was hopeless. And I said, you know what? I'm going to hold that hope for you until you're ready to pick that up. I'm going to be here with you to walk along the journey with you. And so that they know that they have someone that they can come to that's going to help them, that's not going to judge them, that's not going to blame them, because oftentimes victim survivors experience that from their family members and from the community who blame them. And so there's a lot of guilt. And so here is a resource, someone that they can speak to about what they're going through, who can speak their language, I often say, and understand their journey and walk alongside with them. So I'll turn it over to Ms. Detective Juno to tell us a little bit about the high-risk domestic violence investigative process.
Thank you, Cheryl. So I have a multi-purpose position here as the domestic violence detective. First of all, one of my roles is I take on all the reports of domestic related incidents and I review them. I refer those reports to Ms. Himes and Ms. Chavers so that way they can do follow-ups with those victims. If there's any crimes that are mentioned to them, they refer those back to me to investigate. I compile a list of what would be a high risk investigation. So crimes such as aggravated assault, strangulations, serious criminal offenses involving intimate partner violence. I take on those cases from the officers and I continue on in the investigation. Look for further instances of violence where they could be prosecutable and obtain those necessary warrants for those particular cases. Reach out to the victims, conduct interviews of those victims and suspects to further my investigation and bring to court for justice for the victims. Another portion of my responsibility as the domestic violence detective is we have assessment tools that we use, and I monitor those assessment tools amongst the 3 precincts that we have in Newport News. They are cellular phones, and the officers, when they respond to intimate partner violence, domestics, they are to ask the victims a series of questions to determine what the lethality of that situation is. Upon completing those questions, they are given those victims an opportunity to speak with someone directly with our transitions hotline to get better services. That information comes to us, our outreach liaison and our specialists, who then make that contact with that victim to see if any other additional support is needed to the victims. It also comes to me, so that way I can monitor to make sure that the phones are being upkept and distributed correctly to the precincts, and the officers are utilizing that equipment. They also reach out to me, so that way I can further the investigation if need be. So it's like a very oiled machine what we have going on here. So those are basically my roles and responsibilities as the domestic violence detective.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.
You know, we're, as we talked about earlier, about being in a new time, a new era for law enforcement, for advocates, for our nation, truly. In the law enforcement who's logged on today will recognize the terms of 21st century policing. And really, that's where we're grounded. You know, the last year of President Obama's tenure in office, he developed a task force that came together to really chew on the idea of how are law enforcement being effective in United States communities, in neighborhoods. And really what we found over and over and over again is communication and trust and transparency. If we don't have a trust component between law enforcement and the community members, then we've stopped before we've started. And as we look at this issue of domestic violence, if we always do what we've always done, we're never going to be any further ahead than we are right now today. So that means change must happen. And by bringing all of us together, what we have is a first responder who is now trained and trauma informed, meaning that first contact that they make with a citizen in crisis, they come with the understanding of what trauma has done to them now and in the past, and they can communicate effectively to build trust and bring hope. That very quick handoff then goes to crisis intervention, and that includes advocacy and connection to other resources, to the prosecutor's office and the victim witness office, to local shelters, and whatever challenges those citizens are meeting that are preventing them from leaving their situation, preventing them from being able to find change. And then I like to think of our team as a mosaic. We are not the tiles. We are the grout that brings the tiles together so that you can see the big picture, because we have so many. And if you look right here on the domesticshelters.org organization, there is resource after resource after resource. What we find is we need something that brings us all together. And that's what we've developed, is bringing everyone together. So that timing is critical. From the moment of crisis to the moment that the victim can become a survivor and an overcomer and walk into their future with hope and breathing a life that is positive and safe and well for them and their family, then and only then have we been successful in what we do, each of us in our endeavors. Now, what the interesting component here is we understand it's very critical to have experts, and 21st century policing does that. And as we look as leadership going forward into the future, I cannot be the expert of everything, but I can look to you, and I can look to you, and I can look to you. But I can be really good at what I do, just as you can be really good at what you do. And if we collaborate together, communication is key. If we're able to do that and share that information together, find and understand what resources are available, whether it's something as simple as finding a shelter for a cherished pet, or giving a link or a resource to someone who might be going through maybe not the criminal justice system, but maybe a civil system for divorce or child welfare or whatever that challenge is in their life, then we have a direction we can point them in. And Ms. Shavers loves to use the word soft handoff or warm handoff, and we've all embraced that because that's truly what it's about. If I give Ms. Himes a number and say, here, call this number, they'll help you. What are the chances that that's going to happen? When we're in crisis as human beings, it is extremely difficult to see past the wall of challenges that face us. So it's important there's that extra warm hand that can lead the way to resources, lead the way to overcoming those challenges. And that's where we find ourselves. So as we look to the future and we look to continue planning and growing our program, because really we're just scratching the surface. When we look into the future, we see opportunity for mental health awareness and mental health care workers coming on board as second responders. We see the need for interventions with child welfare. We see the need that not only domestic violence advocacy, but violent crime advocacy. We see the need for more law enforcement first responders to have more training, more understanding, continued practice in what is important to understand as one human being wearing a clothing that looks like mine goes into the home of another and walks just for a moment in that person's life when they're in crisis. And how do we make that change effective? How do we set cases up that are going through the criminal justice system to where we don't have re-victimization, to where our prosecutors are able to take well-built cases that come from the extra assistance and aid from a high-risk detective, so that when we do go to court and we do have that opportunity to stand up and say, this is my day, this is when I get to say, this is what happened to me, but no more, then we have the judicial system functioning for us. And for those who are not ready for that, we have opportunities for them. Just because there's not an arrest, just because someone says, I can't do that, doesn't mean they don't get to have help. And that is the bottom line. There's hope and there's help for everyone in need. And that is the wide range of messaging. You all talked about the referrals that police officers are giving. And what that is if our police officers see something, and we all talk about our spidey senses that we have, and maybe they went to a call for service that had underlying issues that just really resulted in them giving advice or mediating, and no one went to jail, there were no police reports made, but something was deeply wrong. And that is an opportunity for a police officer to reach out to the DV team and say, hey, there is definitely something going on here. And what we find, and I know you all have endless stories at this point, when that phone rings and it is an advocate from the police department, and we hear things like, we didn't know the police cared. We didn't know there was such a thing as a DV team. We didn't know that anyone cared. Or, I was sitting here thinking about suicide, and then you called me. I was sitting here thinking that it was hopeless, and then you called me. Now we're talking about real change in the lives of living human beings. So as we look to the future, we carry this team forward, we continue to educate ourselves more. The moment we stop learning is the moment we become stagnant. So we push our own education forward as we push education out to our law enforcement officers and our advocates, and we maintain our connections to all of you out there. We know that this program will continue to expand and grow. And so I know we're running short on time. I was waiting.
Poll question number 2.
I know, I was waiting for Nisha to kick me under the table.
I missed my cue. Sorry.
I'll go ahead and open the second poll question, and then I know you have, some kind of call to action and vision for the future, to send out to everyone. And then we have quite a few questions. So why don't we do the poll, and then we'll go into the Q&A section and then give you some time to wrap up.
So there's no one better suited for the call to action than Ms. Chavers. I feel like I need to get up and high five everyone after she talks. So Ms. Chavers, please, will you start with that?
Certainly, right after we do this poll, is that okay?
Yes.
Sounds good. Yes. So we have about 10, 15 more seconds here. The question for everyone kind of listening on Facebook Live and those that are tuning in later is, I believe the placement of civilian advocates within law enforcement is beneficial. And so just yes, no, or undecided. We'll do another 5 seconds here. Okay, so looking at our results, overwhelmingly, 96% of everyone, excuse me, answered yes. And then 12 people or 4% were undecided. And so what do you guys think of that result? Is that pretty common?
That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah.
It is common, and what it shows is even if we had not given this presentation and we started with that question, there would be very similar results. What we're here to show everyone and to express to everyone is not only is it true, but that it works. And we're happy to say that as we measure the data Ms. Chavers talked about, and it's important to be able to capture that. One, how effective are we, and can we make change that would make us more effective? But the data definitely shows having embedded advocates within our law enforcement agency, even though that creates some challenges being a system-based advocate as opposed to a community-based advocate. And there's certainly not been, without speed bumps in the road, making these adjustments to system-based. It truly has proven that this system works. We're able to reach more lives in crisis than we've ever been able to do before.
And so what I would say is that I believe in our area, we're the only domestic violence team, victim-based advocacy placed in a police department in our area. So that's very unique. And it takes a lot of guts to do that. And let me also share that domestic violence is a topic that makes many people uncomfortable, and understandably so. But oftentimes people suffer because they live in silence. And so we cannot shun or pretend like this issue does not exist and not do something about it. And so I want to encourage those in the communities to plant seeds of hope, that you can do something to help someone who is experiencing domestic violence, whether that's serving as an ambassador, the information that you've heard today, sharing it with other people. When you hear about the different types of domestic violence, the red flags that people may experience, share that information. Pay attention to that spidey sense that you may have that says that something's going on, and reach out to that individual. Get educated on what's taking place with domestic violence and how best to help someone. Find out what resources are available in the community to be able to help. Our community members, you're on the first line of defense, and so we're asking for your help. We want to say thank you to those of you who have joined in this webinar. We hope that the information shared today has been invaluable, and that it has planted a seed of hope in you. I often say plant seeds because you never know which one will grow. And we're hoping that out of this program, it will grow and blossom and be able to transform and change lives. And we just want to say thank you.
Oh, can I add? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm like, let me add real quick. I know we had a question, or not a statement rather, on the call to action where it says, survivors, what would you like to see? And that was very important. And I just wanted to take a second to give a shout out to our chief, Steve Drew, because he's just very passionate about domestic violence, about eliminating it, and how we can assist, what we can do to change it in our community and beyond. And I remember Chief asking us a question a few months back, what do you think we should do next? What should we add to the program? And I said, well, have you asked survivors? Have you asked survivors what they would like? And then he said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, that's who this is for, right? And he said, you know what? Let's do it. So I said, don't play with me, I'll get a bunch of survivors in here. And that is exactly what happened. Not even 2 days later, Chief of Police sat with several survivors who experienced domestic violence 20 years prior, 2 years prior, some trying to leave the relationship currently. And he sat and for 2 hours listened to what survivors wanted and what they needed. So our call to action to survivors, please put in the chat line or feel free to email us when we put our email up in the next slide, what you would like to see in this program. What would you like to see the advocates do? What you would like to see the officers do? Because if anybody's voice matters, it's yours.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
oh, that's another high five, right? Okay.
Fantastic. Ladies, we have had so many questions come in, and I'd like to maybe knock out a couple of them, but then would you be open if I were to send those over via email, maybe put together a little resource for our participants today, making sure all of the questions were answered?
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Okay, let me just, if that's okay, just go to a couple of questions, or are there anything else that you'd like to add?
No, questions
Okay.
are great, we're ready.
All right. So Cindy wanted to know, do you use the lethality assessment program? And if so, is it an effective part of your intra-agency connection?
Thank you, Cindy, for asking that question, and the answer is yes. So Virginia, some years ago, adopted a hybrid of the Maryland model for the lethality assessment protocol. So Virginia has its own now, but it's very similar to the Maryland model. And we do use that data not only to determine the high risk that Detective Juno is working on, but we also use that data to connect our survivors to local shelters and to local support systems and resources. But then it also does a third bit for us as well. It gives us that all important critical data. And the data helps us in several areas. One, we know who our target audience is. Where in the city is it most affected? And also we're able to direct funding. And in many organizations, what we hear over and over again is funding is one of the most difficult parts. And truly it is. So we are partly funded by grant and we are partly funded by our city. So every dollar and every penny counts. So it's important that we're able to use that data to direct those important dollars in the right area. So we use the LAP to by every single officer on the street is a part of that protocol as well, and the DV team in the special victims unit is a part of it also.
Fantastic. And one other question that came in was, you guys are a wonderful group of women, but how do you account for diversity within your program, and how do you make sure, not only serving people of color, but people, in the LGBTQ community? How does diversity, come into this strategy?
That is a great question. And Detective Juno is new here because our male detective just retired after 31 years of service. So the team is not new to having a detective. We've had a detective on board since the beginning as a critical component to the team. And it just so happens that we're all women today. And I firmly believe that's going to change as we grow. But also, we're also an agency that is very diverse in men and women and members of the LGBTQ community, our police officers here and civilians here in our agency. And each of those first responders are trained in part of that critical trauma-informed training, first responder communication, how important that is. And we've actually had some experience with members of the LGBTQ community. And I remember a personal experience. A transgender person said to me, I didn't think anyone would believe me because I'm transgender. And it was heartbreaking. So our message going forward is domestic violence doesn't care who you are or what you look like. It can affect everyone. And we have that same perspective. If domestic violence is happening here, happening to you, then we are here to help.
That's fantastic. Well, ladies, I know that there are so many people out here who are thinking, I want to adopt all of you into my community and into my local police departments. So, I think the information that you shared today was so helpful and so eye-opening to see how a police department is really tackling domestic violence and really, bringing education to the people who are interacting with survivors on a day-to-day basis. So I'm just so grateful for the work that you're doing. We are getting at the very end of our time here, so I will go ahead and I'll grab all the questions out of the Q&A and on Facebook, and I'll send those over to you. If anyone has any additional questions, feel free to email me at Ashley, ASHLEY, at domesticshelters.org, and I'll make sure that those questions get posed to the team. And we'll go ahead and we'll send out the recording, certificates of attendance, and any other resources to everyone who's attended today. With that, any last words before we wrap up today?
Thank you.
Yes, thank
you. Just
Thank
for
you, and
embracing us. Thank you.
Of course. And I did want to say, I did not pay anyone on this team to say such wonderful things about domesticshelters.org. We're so grateful that, we found the resources on our site to be helpful. We are so grateful to know that those resources are helping people in your community and beyond. So with that, thank you everyone for attending today. We're so grateful to have you here. Again, we have another webinar coming up on Tuesday. You can find more information about that on domesticshelters.org/events. With that, we'll go ahead and sign off and everyone have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.